Hello. Hi. How you doing? Good, good. Nice to see you. Yeah.
Yeah, what made you interested in the tenement, the Scottish tenement and the Glasgow tenement specifically? What was it that made you want to write your dissertation on it?
Well, I think when I don't live in a tenement, but when I was looking for flats, the awkward corners of like bathrooms and stuff, uh, and how the flats were divided, the way the windows were sealed off, and stuff like that was quite interesting. And how some of the flats, because they need insulation, they are quite double layered, so the walls inside are built up. So there's like a little gap between the original wall and the secondary wall, the windows and everything. So just because of that, it made me interested. So did you have the read with the questions? What did you think?
Yeah, your dissertation covers quite a broad spectrum of ideas
Yeah.
and that, so it's quite interesting. So I don't know if you just wanted me to talk through the different points, the 6 points that you sort of sent through to me. Yeah, if you want me, I can share my screen and show you some stuff that might be of interest to you. You can see that it's just a PDF. So I think the idea of what I think is the oldest Scottish influences to the continental form of housing typified by the tenement is I I think the Scottish tenement is its own unique development. I don't think that any sort of plan form or anything like that was really brought over from the continent, and I don't really think that Scottish tenements then influenced what was happening, particularly in Germany or the Low Countries or France. They have their own sort of story of living, but I think the conditions were quite similar and why tenement living was prominent in Europe. Uh, but I would say that the Scottish tenement originates from the Burgh system that was implemented in the 12th century, so in the 1100s by King David. And that was really to control taxation and to control trade and to control, formalize urban settlements. And that's really when modern day urban Scotland started. It was in the 12th century. And it was really because, as you'll see with the Royal Mile in Edinburgh or the route from Glasgow Cathedral down to Saltmarket, there were always one straight street, the High Street. And then the Burgh plots sort of came off of that. So you really get like this sense of development. So on the left hand side is the what would be like an early 11th century example, which is what you're sort of talking about. You take the vernacular sort
Yeah.
of Crook House of Scotland or the Croft House of Scotland, which is sort of small stone walls and then a thatched roof. And each person that lived in the burgh or who operated had a plot of land that they lived off of that came off of this. So it was a very thin, straight plot of land. Over time in the 15th century, as populations increased, they sort of grew naturally to being 2 stories, mainly timber built at that point. So built out of timber, timber galleries, jetties, and usually you'd have a shop at the bottom and then a four-stair, particularly in the east of Scotland, coming up the front to access a house in the top. And in the back of your plot, you would have what was called your workhouse or your backland tenement. So that would be like a workshop. So you're talking about people who are like, your butchers, bakers, candlestick makers. They would live at the front with their shop, but in the back they would have where they would make their goods and then sell them at the front in the shop. So that's how it sort of evolved. But then as from 1606 onwards, and you can really see that when you look at this map of Edinburgh in 1581, you can see how like small the houses are, like the plots.
Yeah.
It really is maybe 2 3 stories family houses with still green space in the plot for growing food, for workshops, that sort of thing. And then really it's 1606 onwards when what happened in Britain at the time was what's called the Act of the Union, the Union of the Crowns in 1606, when the King of Scotland became King of England, and there was no more sort of what in Scotland we call the Wars of Independence, the wars with England. So peace became there was no more wars on the mainland in Britain, and within 100 years, this was Edinburgh then, and you can see how the towns grew as war was no longer an issue. Cities weren't getting sieged upon. Trade became, a lot freer. And when that happened, that's when population started to grow, particularly in cities like Edinburgh, Stirling. So that's how, and then the people started to rent their floors out. So it was actually a very natural progression of something that started back in the 1200s. And I don't know if you know about this building, Gladstone's Land.
Yeah, I just heard briefly about it, but yeah.
This is the oldest surviving example of a tenement from the 17th century. So the oldest sort of full Scottish tenement that exists today. And it's a National Trust property now. You can go visit it when things are open again. But you can see the floor plan it's really just a very straight line, single plot, built very close together. It's just one or two rooms feeding into each other with different stairs to access different levels, and each floor would then be rented out to a different person. So the evolution of the tenement in Scotland was really from the plot constraint, and the plot size and width came from the Burgh system and how land was divided up to people who lived in the town. And then as populations increased after 1606, it just naturally, because you have such a thin space, you only have one room deep or one room wide, you have to start living vertically if you start renting them out to different people, because you can't rent horizontally. So that's how the tradition of the tenement started in Scotland, I would say. One thing is this tenement is from the 16th, 17th century, and a lot of people do claim that you see these dormers at the top, the stone coming up. A lot of people say that was an influence from countries like the Netherlands, Northern Germany, because at that time in the 1600s, trade even though the king was the same, trade wasn't really a big thing between Scotland and England. They were still quite hostile to each other, but most of Scotland's trade was from the east coast to Northern Europe. So, like in Amsterdam and that, you get these sort of Dutch gables.
Yeah.
So a lot of people say this sort of dormer arrangement came from influences from Northern France, the Netherlands, Northern Germany. Stylistically, it came back from there. So there's a little bit of debate about that, but that's what I would say. Evolutionally, Scottish tenement individually evolved because of urban layouts, and then population growth after after the Union of the Crowns. So that's what I would say to that sort of question, very basically. Don't know if you have any questions on that. I think you can get the plans of Gladstone's Land off of a website called Canmore. So I'll send a link to you, because these are sort of the most authentic, oldest tenement plans, or what we would say as a tenement in Scotland that exist. So I can send that on to you after this. So I was just wondering about your second question. What did you mean by the thatched houses being the sort of first tenements?
It's just while I was reading, as you were talking about how the initial houses had a long plot at the back, and so these houses, I meant like the material, the thatched roof material, and these houses, then I was talking about how they went up to 2 stories with like working from home, so that's why they kind of went 2 stories, and that's how I kind of talk about it. and then they kept going higher, and then that then was switched. The materials were switched into the modern day tenement materials. So that's how I kind of relate to it.
Yeah, it's the original. People sort of think that Scotland is this history of Scottish architecture is all stone, and it's not. And particularly on the east coast of Scotland, well, there wasn't really very many large town settlements on the west coast until you really get to the 1700s, really, until Glasgow sort of becomes a city proper. But as you said that you've been reading the Lost Edinburgh book, and particularly Edinburgh before, like, I think it was 1675 or 1685, was the majority of the buildings were timber frame buildings with lath infill render on the front and yet thatched roofs. And that was a common building material and style in Scottish towns up until that point. The reason it changed is, and the only reason that was because those materials were cheap, they were available, widely available, and they were easy to work. And also they were easy to modify your house. You know, if you know the whole thing about four stairs or four jetties of the wooden tenements of Edinburgh jutting out, people trying to get a bit more space, so they built it out in the timber. You can do that really easily. The reason it changed is because after 1606, the Union of the Crowns, the cities or places like Edinburgh and Stirling exploded in population, and they became super dense. And with that density, the risk of fire became even more present. And because everything was built so close together and there was such density, there was devastating fires in Scotland from 1650 until 1680. There was a whole series of devastating fires that wiped out most of some towns. So Glasgow, there was one in 1668, I think, or 1670, I can't remember, which wiped out nearly every building in the city. In Edinburgh, there was similar fires. So each local borough council implemented rules all sort of about the same time in the 1670s and 1680s, where it said that, you know, so this was the Burgh Act from the council in 1677. So it's wrote in Old Scots or basic Scots, so you won't be able to understand it. It's a bit like bastardized English, but it's basically it says you're not allowed to build any buildings of timber anymore. They all had to be stone faced, and the reason stone faced is because stone in Scotland was plentiful. It was available. They'd been building castles and fortifications out of it for years, and because of the wet weather in Scotland, you couldn't really make good quality bricks. Unlike in England, so it was easier to carve stone than it was to make good quality facing bricks. You could make, load bearing, pretty cruddy bricks for internal walls and that, but not good quality facing bricks. So it was really the threat of fire that changed it. So yeah, you're right. In the East Coast, timber and thatch and render were the predominant building material, and there's some surviving examples in Edinburgh, but not many. So yeah, you're right, but the switch to stone really happened in the 1670s. So you said you had the Lost Glasgow book by Carol Foreman. This quote's in it somewhere. This quote's in, I can't remember what page number it is, but this is a quote from that. So yeah.
Like I also as you were talking about the fortification and how the stones were possibly abundant for the use, and I have talked about thatched houses, and that's how I connected to the castles and tower houses, is going through with the end of the act of hazards of fire and stuff, and that's how I connected to the castles and tower houses. So yeah, it's, I don't know. I'm trying to find this weird pathway which I've like just digging deeper and deeper. So it's quite interesting.
It's quite interesting. It's interesting because it's that the tenement and the idea of old Scotland is so ingrained to some extent because it's a manufactured image, to be honest with you. In the 1800s, the idea of Scotland and Scottishness was sort of not made up, but sort of galvanized for political reasons. And the idea of it always being stone is something people have to sort of get over. But there wasn't a lot of settlements like that were like what you would think would be very dense. You had Edinburgh's Old Town as the prime example, and then you had some other smaller settlements. Glasgow at that time, the buildings would have only been 2 to 3 stories throughout. They would have been built quite dense together, but they wouldn't have been, the 6 to 8 to 13 stories of the Old Town, or even the 4 to 5 stories of today. So 1600s Glasgow was a relatively small town, a very small town actually, and it was only in the 1700s when the Act of the Union happened and trade was allowed between Scotland and America, and Glasgow was ideally placed for that, being on the Atlantic that it really exploded. So the thatched house it's a sort of proto-tenement, and the fact that it only really happened in a couple of cities, particularly in the East Coast. And yeah, I wouldn't really say there was much. Just jumping onto your fourth point, I wouldn't really say there was much link between the idea of castle living and the idea of urban living. I think they are two different things, because they were, at that time castles, as you probably know from reading, they were one that was played a defensive role. But they were also symbolic, and also not just symbolic in how they looked, but symbolic in how the families inside lived. And that's why you get that shift from vertical living to horizontal living to be more European or English as you get further into the 1700s. But an interesting thing from your point of view is, I don't know if the oldest sort of example of what you might call an urban castle is this guy here. So this is the residence of the Knights Hospitallers of St. John of Jerusalem. So it was a sort of religious order. You could class it as a tenement because it was like you had multiple people living there, but you also had like a communal hall. So it wasn't a single family residence. It was like people would come and stay. And this is the oldest townhouse / tenement, you could maybe say, that was ever recorded in Linlithgow, which is an old Scottish town now. It's like just a little town, but at the time it was quite big. And you can see the plan of it, where you have the street and you have your pen coming in. So you have your front tenement there, and then you have a communal hall, and then you have a courtyard, and then your turnpikes there. And this is a view of the back court. You can see the hall, and you can see the section there where it goes up to 4 stories. So in this image, you can see the 4 tenement at the front there. So I'll send you a link to this because you can get this on the internet. So there's a cross-pollination, I would say, between the sort of castle aesthetic that gets brought in from countryside residences by wealthy families, by religious orders like this, because at the time in Scotland, 1600s, 1700s, the look, the castle look, like your crow step gables, your turrets, all of this sort of stuff, it wasn't really for defence. It was portraying an idea of being Scottish and being martial, like being militaristically powerful, which at the time was very important to show strength to England and people in England, because Scotland, remember, became part of a union with England at this time, first through the royals and then 100 years later through the Parliament. And Scotland has always had this sort of like little brother syndrome, because you're like a smaller nation, we're always a victim, all of this sort of stuff. So the idea that your architecture, your buildings portray this as you're sort of strong and powerful is really aimed at the English. And that's brought in from castles and brought into then townhouses like this. And also, you know, when you look at stuff like, you know, there's sort of great examples in the Lost Edinburgh book, you know, like this guy here, you know, so that's you know, that's, you know, Robert Gourley's house, but it's purposely made to look like a castle. Obviously there's like vernacular elements of construction that happen, you know, but they purposely make it look like a castle. So they're bringing a style in to the town. I would say mainly for politics. I don't know if you've ever, if you ever get a chance and you're interested, you should read this book called Scotch Baronial. It just came out, and it talks about how this idea of this castle aesthetic is really a political play by Scotland to some extent, or there's like a lot of political connotations through the time periods. So I would say that's where your link is. I would say your link really isn't to do with how people live. It isn't real, because people living in tower castles in Scotland at the time when the burghs start to expand, the 1600s and 1700s, they were more showpieces than they were like military fortifications, except in the Jacobite wars, but that's a different thing. But like they were more like for wealthy families, you know, really wealthy families, landowners who were portraying a certain lifestyle, whereas the common people who lived in the brothers, they were living on one floor and they were living in very small conditions. So you can't really say they bring it over. It's really more the aesthetic that gets brought over, I would say, in the initial period. Yeah, so, and you can see that in Worsdall doesn't really talk about it, but you can see that in the 17 to 21 High Street example.
So, I was just going to tell you about that one.
So you can see how it has both that castle aesthetic, it has the stone from the sort of changes to the rules of construction, but also has the dormers like Gladstone's Land, which some people argue come from Northern Europe, a sort of aesthetic of the Dutch gable. So a lot of times people call, or before now, people used to call the Scotch baronial, some elements of it, the Flemish style, you know, the hot style from Holland, because they used to say it came from over there. But so I would say it's more a stylistic thing. But this guy here is the oldest one, the Knights of this one that we have a record of. It no longer exists. It was demolished by the Victorians, but you can see it's like a piece of like domestic architecture that has that castle aesthetic to it that might be of interest to you, or might be it might be a linking strand between some of your things.
Yeah, that is true, because I came to this idea because I was looking at the Bishop's Castle, and it had like a tower house aesthetic, and in front of it had the province. I forgot the name of the tenement. It had the similar aesthetic, the one which you're talking about here, and the plan also is a bit similar to the one we are looking at here. So that's quite why I thought I could connect that in that way without knowing the other part of the history. So
there's a lot of cross contaminate. There's a lot of like links. It's sort of like a natural evolving thing. before you get to the 1700s, and then that's when things started.
Mhm.
The mid 1700s is when things sort of change, because that's when the idea of classicism really comes in from Europe.
True.
But yeah, so maybe that's moved on to that.
Yeah, I have briefly mentioned it, but I mentioned it mostly in the fact of the creation of Newtown and move to the westwards of Glasgow, and how detached houses became a thing. And that's where I have mentioned it.
The creation of the new town in Edinburgh, and it wasn't as you know, like then everywhere, like from the 1750s, that this idea of the Scottish Enlightenment happening, you know, like this idea of like, you know, the sort of Georgian Enlightenment, where everyone sort of woke up from the medieval haze and you know became sort of like rational and reasonable, and they used to think in terms of like that. And yeah, the new town in Edinburgh is like the ultimate built form of that. You know, very rational, very grid-like. But I would say, and that happened all over Scotland as well. Glasgow had its many series of new towns. Sort of failed. A lot of them became failed new towns, because the new town in Edinburgh was only for rich people. It was only for rich people, and I would also say it was all townhouses. It wasn't tenements. It was all townhouses, because what the Scottish were trying to do at that time, where they were, one, there was the Enlightenment, so they wanted to sort of be modern, be rational in terms of a European context, because that's the only context that mattered. But they also wanted to show the English that they were, you know, highbrow. They weren't like a backwater, and they also wanted to retain a lot of the sort of rich sort of aristocracy who started to move down to London. So what the new town really is, in my opinion, is it's two London Georgian townhouse squares that's linked by a couple of Georgian rational blocks. Because that is, because when you look at because the new town in Edinburgh, the one we all know, is the second new town. The first new town is actually to the south. It's St George's Square, where the University of Edinburgh is now. And that's just a London Georgian, you know, like you see in the old period films, the little brick townhouses in London.
Yeah.
Like that's what they were trying to build up here. And that's what the new town is. And you're quite right that Glasgow tried to do that first south of the river, which became a disaster because there was no sort of rules to it, and it became a sort of overrun with industry and all of that sort of stuff. And it was only really the Blytheswood Square that happened. And yeah, you're right, it was all townhouses, it wasn't tenements. And I say that, but there was some like this is a new town in Edinburgh townhouse. So this is on North Castle Street. But you can see it's 3 doors, but actually it's 4 flats. You know, like you come in on the ground floor, there's a flat to the left, a flat to the right, and then a stair that brings you up to flats on the upper floors. But when you look at the facade, it's masquerading as a townhouse. It sort of hides the sort of division. It's making itself not look like a tenement, and it was quite on purpose. So yeah, I would say that the new town movement is really more to do with the Scottish Enlightenment and also this idea of rationalism, but also, as you quite rightly point out, it's the move of the wealthy, the rich people, out of the medieval sort of areas, the sort of crowded, you know, wines and alleys of the Royal Mile, of the High Street in Glasgow, to somewhere that's a bit more spacious, a bit more open, a bit, you know, you have your own front door, you have all this sort of stuff. It's almost like, you know, what happened after the Second World War, where everyone moved out of the inner city to go and live in suburbia, you know, with your own little porch or your little car. So it's the same sort of thing that happened here. It was a very elitist thing that happened. So
I mean, after the City Improvement Trust started building new improved tenements, they had the aesthetic of like I don't know, castles, kind of like a
Yeah.
very glorified aesthetic.
You're
At least in Charing Cross, you can see that.
Yeah, you're completely right. Talking about these guys.
Yeah, I jumped. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
that's the salt market tenements. So that's So these were 1892, and yeah, you're the Glasgow Improvement Trust tenements, and you're right, they do have castellation because that was at this period, the 1850s onwards, the idea of what we call castellation, or making things look like castles, is a very political thing in Scotland to portray this idea of old Scotland. So you know, it's quite bizarre because you think this is older than it is, but it's sort of it happens a lot. You know, like stuff like tartan, shortbread. You know, Rob Roy, the stories of William Wallace, and some is true, some is not. They were all sort of made up to some extent. And it's true, it's completely true. It was two French brothers who made tartan or codified tartan. And it was all this idea of making up a Scottish culture. So in the East, in Edinburgh, because it's the capital, that's very much pushed. In Glasgow, the only people who are pushing it is, as you say, the City Improvement Trust or the government, the council, because they are an arm of the country, and you know the government's trying to push this idea that politically they're trying to push it, so they're pushing it through the architecture. But the rest of Glasgow is still classical, and that's why to me, that's why Glasgow stands out, because Glasgow's so much bigger than Scotland. To some extent, Glasgow's its own entity, and you do get these little things like this guy, or this tenement round the corner is a City Improvement Trust tenement by A.B. MacDonald as well. And you can see how castellated that is. That's made to look like a castle, but it's just a tenement. And the floor plans are actually pretty below the middle class tenements, you know, because when you look at the floor plans here, that's a free off the core. You know, you have two, you know, you come in and there's two rooms to that. You still have the two bed recesses, room and kitchen on the other side, and then a single end in the middle. And the only real improvement in this plan, so this is the lower working class built by the city for poor people. The only improvement in this plan from their model from the 1870s, so this is like the only improvement in 25 years that the council made was they added an extra toilet on. And, you know, Worsdall talks about these ones in this one, and he says, you know, that's because, you know, they wanted a toilet for men and women. But remember, at this time, you could have 9 people living in one of these room and kitchens. So you could have maybe up to 25 people living on that floor. So, I mean, you say it's an improvement, but it's not really.
Quite odd. Yeah, it's quite odd because the frontage does not match the interior and the way the people were living inside. So,
it's a political thing, or it's a purposely aesthetic choice. But also, it might be a bit too harsh saying it's just a political thing. It isn't also just a political thing. Remember, these tenements that replaced that on High Street. On High Street, it was a very old, it was a medieval street, and it did still have like old, it did have like
houses.
So like, you know, it had, so this was a high street here. So what they were trying to also do is they were knocking them down because they were substandard and build new accommodation, but they were then also trying to aesthetically, the Victorian idea of conservation was you rebuilt in the same style as what you knocked down. So all they were doing was they knocked down old buildings and they built buildings that had a style, the Scottish baronial style that referred back to them. So there was a bit of architectural conservation, not as we would know it. You know, we would call it a pastiche. we would call it mimicry, you know, the sort of shit they do in China right now, you know, like it's not real, but the Victorians felt it was real. And to some extent it was real because they were using essentially the same construction methods, you know, good quality stone, carving, like they were building the same way people were building 100 to 150 years before. So it's debatable, but you're right, there's definitely castellation there, definitely.
If we come back to because I think we missed the third question. I just wanted to ask that one again about the Clayton industrial communities.
Yeah.
Talk to me a bit about that.
Yeah, Calton sort of suffered the same fate as the Gorbals, but it's not really known as much. And the reason people don't really talk about it a lot is because it was, as you say, it was a very working class area and it had a lot of industry. It primarily grew up on the cotton industry. You're quite right. After the tobacco trade sort of fell after the American War of Independence, sort of cut that trade off. The cotton industry really flourished. You had the weavers in Calton, and there was a lot of like early development of Calton, so like in the late 1700s, and it was a lot of rundown. By the time you got to the early 20th century, it was very rundown. It was a very like overpopulated area. I don't know if you know why in Europe, every city in Europe, the West End is always the good end and the East End is always the bad end. But it's because
there's like a speculation about the wind.
It's the wind,
direction.
yeah. So you get all the winds from the Atlantic blow all the smoke to the east of the city. So everything east of the city, of where a city starts to grow, is always the bad area because it was always inundated with smoke. So and the west side was always nice because the wind was always blowing it away. So Calton was a very industrial area, and there was a lot of big industrial plants just, you know, where the brewery is, the Tenements brewery. Along that strip of land, there used to be, or there still is, the Mollander burn that runs under the city, and that powered a lot of mills, a lot of production. That's why the brewery is there. There was also a lot of chemical work. As you got to the 1850s onwards, a lot more heavy industry. But they all had chimneys that all blew along there. So it really became a production area very, very quickly, the late 1700s onwards. And then it just sort of became run down, and no one was ever really interested in looking after it because everyone that had money was moving to the west. So the west sort of became that. And you got areas further east, like Denniston, that sort of grew up, who were outside the smoke path, or as the smoke sort of, the heavy industry started to die away, they sort of started to show up. So yeah, and then what happened was the Bruce Plan, that after the Second World War.
Yeah.
So that was an area that was just completely razed, and the reason it was like completely knocked down, the same reason the Gorbals got knocked down, it was working class people. All the accommodation was rented. They were compulsorily purchased, and they were all knocked down. And there was meant to be another, you know, out of the motorway, the M8 comes through Glasgow past the Mitchell Library. There was meant to be another motorway on the other side, and that's why a lot of that got knocked down. That motorway was never completed, but because it all got knocked down, but then the compulsory development area, what they called, you know, these areas after the Second World War, according to the Bruce Plan, never got developed. It just became a waste ground, and it never really got developed again until really the late 1970s. And what you're referring to as the suburban area is the little 2-story, 3-story houses. They were all built by a government agency. Most of them were built by the council, the city council, and also a government agency called the Scottish Special Housing Association. and it was really, and then there was something called GEAR, which was the Glasgow Eastern Regeneration Area, or the Glasgow Eastern Area Regeneration, something like that, the GEAR scheme, which was trying to rehabilitate it. And to some extent, it's still not been done. There's a few, what's now the council call the transformational areas. So every 10 years, the name gets changed in council policy just because it's like, that's just what happens. They say it's new, but what they're building now isn't the suburban ideas, because that was like still based on the sort of 1970s thought, which was sort of still against density. But now you're getting schemes on Gallagate, which are much more dense, sort of new tenements. You know, like, so, and there was also new tenements in the early 90s there, a couple of really famous postmodern ones. So yeah, it's because it was a poor person's area and it was forgotten about. That's the real answer why Calton is sort of was devastated and is still a bit not developed. It was heavy industry gone, people knocked it down, no one wanted to live there, and the council never built anything there. So that's the real reason why it's that. Yeah,
it's just I mentioned this question because of the fact that it's very close to the Barrowland and the Barras Market, and right next to it is the High Street, very close to it also, the Tron Gate. And so it's just so odd that you have that and then it's just downhill to a suburb. So that's why.
You're right, it is mad, it is crazy. It's so crazy, like how not dense it is. Yeah, I know.
Well, I'd like to just come back to the sixth one then, and yeah, I hope we have time left.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting one, and I know what you're trying to say. The tenement in Glasgow, in Scotland in general, has such nostalgia today for Scottish people or people who are from the city, and for everyone who talks about it. And it's really difficult to separate nostalgia from fact. Like, my grandparents grew up in the Gorbals, they grew up on Florence Street and in Adelphi Terrace, they grew up in like a roomy kitchen, you know, sleeping in a bed recess and all of this sort of stuff. The best book I could recommend is Up or Close, and there's a lot of like books about Glasgow history and living in the tenements and living in all this sort of stuff. This is the best one that sort of succinctly says architecturally how things were placed and all this, and isn't just like anecdotal stories. But I would say it does come from, I would say that idea. So I mean, you've seen this image. This is this is a famous image of the Gorbals. And I would say that what you're sort of talking about here is this idea of comfortable communal living. Is something which happened sort of naturally through laws and through shared resources. So you were talked about the City Improvement Trust. Well, they brought in rules about how far you could build tenements apart. So this is a diagram of that, like their rules in 1866. And they promoted a model that was the hollow square, you know, so to allow light in and all this sort of thing. And there's your room and kitchen that we talked about with your single end in the middle. So this is actually the tenement. This is one of the types of tenement that my granny grew up in. They grew up in this room and kitchen here in the Gorbals in Florence Street. So, you know, it's very plain architecturally, but still has a classicism to it. But what people think of is this image here, or what they think of when they think of tenement living, is this amazing life of communal living where everyone is living in the back court, they're sharing washing facilities, they're sharing toilets, you know your neighbours, there's safe places for your kids to play, there's all of this sort of stuff, and there's that nostalgia where it's like, it was a great place to live because you knew everybody up your close. It was a semi-private space. We were all friends. You left your doors unlocked. People say that you left your doors unlocked, and that's true, they did. But it was also a hard life because you had to share the wash house. And at that time, washing your clothes could take a whole day. By the time you boiled the suds, boiled your clothes, dried it. So if you're sharing a washing machine with 30 other families, you have to stick to a rota. Do you know what I mean? You have to talk to your other people living in your clothes. You have to talk to people. So it meant people got to know each other. And what people also don't remember is the factoring system. So I don't know if closes now, like my close has a factor, and it's someone you pay someone like, a couple pound, money every month, and they clean the clothes, they clean the gutters, any repairs that get done, they organise it. Back in the mid to late 1800s, the factors were very powerful. They were the ones who decided who lived where, and a lot of times people stayed in the closes because they were recommended by people who already stayed there. So it was people who already were your friends, already your family, people you already worked with. So you were already there was this community, but the community was also this sort of weird thing where it was like you sort of had not invited, but like you were easier to get a place if you knew someone living in a place who could recommend you, and then you had to share your facilities with everyone. And it was a very hard life. And also women didn't work. Women were there all the time. Men worked. So it was a very old way of living. But those stories of that life from the 1890s and even in during the interwar period, where it's living memory, because my gran can tell you about living there in the 20s and 30s. So it's in living memory that there's such nostalgia for the tenement. There's such nostalgia for that. Almost like that simpler way of life, that simpler time from now that people always have. It's that sort of idea of like living in the countryside and having chickens and all. It's like it's almost sort of make believe now, and people forget the hardships of that actual life, like 9 people living in 2 rooms. And what you're asking is, do the new tenements have the best living of that? And I would say they don't, because they're completely different. The example I always cite is, like, I don't know if you were at uni when Ken McRae taught there, but his tenement in Shakespeare Street, that was one of the new tenements, 1888. But when you look at the plan and the section, it's so not a normal flat, because it's a housing association flat. So every floor is different. Every floor has different bedrooms. There isn't a sort of equality of living spaces. People have different arrangements, and also more importantly, you're not sharing a wash house. So, and you're not sharing an outside toilet. So there's no real need to talk to your neighbours. There's, apart from maybe cleaning the clothes, which is just to keep it clean. Like, you don't need it to like know when you're washing. You don't need to talk to them to know when you need to wash your clothes. So like new tenements, such as like these ones in the Gorbals at Old Burgh Road by Homes Partnership, when you actually look at the floor plans, there's a mix of units. There's a mix of people living here and living there. So, and there's also that removal of semi-private space and shared space as well, because obviously living standards have improved. No one would accept sharing a toilet that's outside anymore, and no one would accept having a wash house in the back that you had to use to wash your clothes. But that was the thing that gelled communities together. And also, no one lives where they work anymore. Like, I mean, now they do because of COVID, but like what I mean is like these tenements weren't like new tenements. People who lived in these new tenements would drive to work. The people all lived before in an urban block. People would all work within walking distance. So all the men would usually work in the same factory or know each other. Nowadays, that doesn't happen. So I think the question is, you have to separate that question from the nostalgia of the tenement and what actually living in a multi-story apartment building is today, and what the benefits of that is. I think there's in an urban context, there's definite benefits. I mean, there's, you know, sustainability benefits, there's density benefits, you know, there is a community aspect because there are still shared things, but it's not the same as the nostalgia of the Glasgow tenement, you know. So I think that's what if you're doing like research on it, you have to like, because when Frank Worsdall wrote A Way of Life, you know, Tenement, A Way of Life, he was writing that from the point of view that he as a kid grew up in the tenements and grew up sharing a washhouse and sharing an outside toilet. He knew what it meant to live in a real tenement, you know, like in a community where you had to share that. I lived in like post-war, I grew up in post-war housing, you know, like I'm a completely different sort of generation. So I think you have to like always separate the nostalgia out from the Glasgow tenement, and analyze it from an architectural point of view. What is the difference between these new tenements and the Victorian tenements? And there's substantial differences, but there's also substantial benefits of high density living or medium density living that these present. So I think that's what you need to, you individually, you know, there's no right or wrong answer. It's what you think is the right answer to urban living. I mean, that's what you're really asking. You're asking, is the tenement, a 4-story tenement, a good form of urban living? And it's up to you to decide. It's an interesting question, and I think it's one that people in Glasgow and Scotland need to sort of wake up from. They have to understand the differences between, from an architectural and an urban point of view. You can't let yourself get caught up in the nostalgic tale of the tenements, you know, because it's a very it's a beautiful story. It's such a Scottish story. It's unbelievable. It's so like you know, the tenement, the sort of homogenizing. It's so Scottish. It's like everyone's equal. It's a homogenizing thing, and then it reaches great peaks, and then they all get destroyed, and but it's such a Scottish story that Scottish people love it, because it's like you have like this idea of an amazing life, egalitarian urban forms, all this sort of, you have the beauty of the Victorian architecture, and then you have the horribleness of the demolitions after the Second World War that evokes a lot of like feelings. And I think you have to separate yourself from not the myth but the story of the tenement to analyze it as an architectural object almost. It's a difficult one, especially for someone like me, but
I mean, looking at those pictures by Thomas Ann were quite influential in the fact that showing how all of that happened, and those were also some of the influences for me to get into this. So
I don't know how much more time you have on your dissertation, but I think in terms of an origin of the tenement, I think it's also good to understand the urban context of Scotland. And if you could ever find your hands on The Making of Urban Scotland, the first chapter, the first couple of chapters in there, you know, it's chapter 1 and 2, urban beginnings in the medieval Burgh, and then 3, the Burgh, Country Steep and Georgian Township. The first 4 chapters are great for understanding how certain urban forms in Scotland sort of developed, and also more specifically for Glasgow, The Making of a City by Andrew Gibb. A very short book, and it takes you through every step of Glasgow. It's such an underrated book. I think everyone should read this book who lives in Glasgow, but it's I'll give you a steer on the sort of the connection between the Burgh and the tenement and how they sort of link together.
Yeah, it's really good. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, It was great talking to you. I hope we keep in contact, and
let me send through once you finish your dissertation. I'd be interested to read it to see what your thoughts are. And you
I would be embarrassed.
No. I'd like to see what your sort of research pulls up. Also, do you have I've never read this dissertation, by J.W. Watt. Do you have a digital copy of that, or is it just?
It's
No,
in
it's
the
just.
GSA.
That's okay.
He talks. It's just he talks about the Roman origins, and I found the dissertation after I had written about the Roman origins, and I was like, wow, okay, he has talked about the same thing.
Yeah, I think the Roman insulae has more bearing on European tenements, like the stuff in Italy and Budapest, Italy, Hungary, the sort of Central European stuff. I think because they're like big urban blocks with courtyards in them. Whereas the Glasgow tenements or the urban were always like linear plots, more like the French model or the Netherlands model. But yeah, no, that's okay. No, I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, it was quite helpful. Yeah, it's quite nice.
I'll send you the links to the medieval house example, and that you might be able to squeeze it in as a linking example in your dissertation.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. See you. Have a good evening. Bye.